All right, I think it's time we get into the main event, the Black Hole of Guyana, the true story of Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre. So, the basis for this segment that we're about to do is this essay by John Judge from 1985 titled The Black Hole of Guyana, The Untold Story of the Jonestown Massacre. Now, this is an excellent piece. John Judge doesn't necessarily tell you what to believe. He just has his thesis and he lays out his argument. He lays out the substance of his argument and lets you decide for yourself. I've read this 3-4 times now. I find it to be incredibly compelling. I'll never be able to look at Jonestown the same way, and I imagine that'll be the same for you guys. But first of all, I'll give sort of the mainstream story of Jonestown and what happened. Basically, there was this preacher named Jim Jones who was luring downtrodden, mentally ill, poor people into this so-called communist cult called the People's Temple in San Francisco that claimed to be this sort of socialist utopian cult. He would give 8-hour sermons every day. There was lots of drug use at the time. And like I said, they were bringing in a lot of disaffected people, but there were also rich people who would join and who would be Jones's sort of higher ups. There were people connected to U.S. intelligence, and there were even people connected to the former Nazis in Germany. And there were a lot of rich people who would help fund the People's Temple. So it wasn't all downtrodden, poor, mentally ill people, but those were the ones who were being brought in, drugged up, and then Jones would manipulate their financial records to basically make them dependent on him. And then people would be shot or drugged up if they tried to leave. So basically, eventually they went from San Francisco to the jungles of Guyana. Guyana's been in the news a bunch lately. It's a Latin American country that borders Venezuela. Congressman Leo Ryan from California visited Jonestown to investigate and find out what was going on there because he had multiple constituents writing him and asking him to investigate the cult. He eventually agreed, flew to Guyana, even though intelligence agents were telling him not to go. He was killed. He was shot when he was there, along with members of the press who were with him. And everybody in Jonestown, 900 people supposedly, all drank cyanide-laced Kool-Aid in what was called the White Night ceremony, and they all died at once. And this is told as a tragic story, a tragic example of what can go wrong with cults and with charismatic leaders. But, if you start to think about it, it's like, would 900 people really all agree to take cyanide at the same time and end their lives? Does that really sound realistic that 900 people would do that all at once? They would agree to end their lives because this one guy, Jim Jones, told them to. It's almost like the CIA, U.S. government stereotype of communism. All the people in the Soviet Union were following Joseph Stalin, and they would have offed themselves if he asked them to. When, of course, that's not the reality. But I want to ask, Noah's a little older than me. What do you remember or know or think about Jonestown, Noah?
Do you think I was alive during Jonestown? Jesus Christ, brother.
No, definitely. Well, maybe. What was it?
It was the late
1970s?
70s that Jonestown starts, right?
Yeah.
I was born in 81.
Okay.
So, no, I do remember when we were kids, there was there was a slang term everybody used to say, Guyana punch, for what we say drinking the Kool-Aid nowadays. And my parents were in the left, right? My dad, well, not kind of. My grandparents loved the communists. My dad was a union guy. My mom, though, came out of the New Left movement, and everybody knew of the People's Temple in her day, right? They were sort of part of this progressive bloc in local San Francisco politics, right? And it's not like there weren't good people involved in it. There were some good people that got pushed into that, right? And they formed this alliance with when the gay movement was militant, with Harvey Milk and his people. And then the establishment sends their gal down there, Diane Feinstein. That's when stuff starts getting hairy. And at the same time, that is when Jim Jones, it starts becoming evident that he is banging everything that moves, right? And manipulating people into this and all the things you expect to see from cult leaders. This is also when Harvey Milk gets shot, right? That what I remember most about this whole block is that that phenomenon, that thing, and the guy who shot him was involved with some FBI people. Like he was just supposedly just some guy, or maybe he was a cop. I forget exactly what it was. But anyway, then he starts talking to the FBI, and then they come up with what they from then on began calling the Twinkie defense. That this guy ate so much junk food that he lost his mind and shot Harvey Milk and got away with it for that. So this is a time where you have to know what's going on in all of the like media narratives and how powerful those are and what they do to people's minds and their views of reality, because this was the age when brainwashing was on everyone's mind. So that didn't seem so unreasonable to people, which is why the tie-in with 900 people and drinking this cyanide Kool-Aid makes sense to people. They can sell that, just like they could sell the Twinkie defense, right? Nobody thought to go, wait a minute, fuck this, I'm leaving, right? Nobody. They're all just like, yes, sir, you know?
All right.
That's all I remember.
Nowadays, based on what we know about brainwashing and even based on what we know from declassified MK Ultra documents, you can't brainwash 900 people into doing that. Or you can't trick someone into doing exactly what you want. You can destroy their brain. You can mess with their brain. In some cases, you can extract the truth out of people, but there's no, magical sort of brainwashing technique to get someone to where you can control them like by remote control. But at the time, like Noah said, that was a big propaganda point that was being pushed. So that's what they convinced people that Jim Jones did. And Feinstein took over for Milk right after he was killed. She was just appointed. And that's how her political career started, was never elected. She was appointed. And there are all sorts of weird connections between Jonestown and the Harvey Milk assassination. And actually, a lot of people who were involved in Jonestown were involved in MLK. His supposed disappearance, which is talked about in this essay. But basically, John Judge makes this argument that originally, when the massacre happened, the Guyanese media reported that 408 people were dead, but 700 people fled to the jungle. But with time, the death counts continued to increase to the point where it was at 913 people dead a few weeks later, and 16 survivors, I guess, who went to the U.S. But so it went from them saying 400 people are dead and 700 people fled into the jungle to them saying now 900 people are dead within a matter of time. So first, the reason the U.S. claimed that the reason for the discrepancy was that the Guyanese can't count. They didn't know how to count, so they counted to 400 when actually the number was 913. But then when they realized that was not a believable story, they started saying that the bodies were hidden. Some of the bodies were piled up on top of other bodies, which made counting them hard, which is hard to believe anyways. But also they had to poke a hole in every single body because the decomposing gases otherwise would have blown them up. So they would have had to poke a hole in each one. It's highly unlikely that they counted 400 when they were actually 900. Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah. The idea that bodies were just piled up on. So first of all, how did bodies get piled up that high that you lose count? Right. Secondly, and I'm sure you'll get to this, it's very strange that they all die of this Kool-Aid and yet they find needle marks in the backs of so many necks.
Almost everyone, 80 to 90% of them had needle marks in their necks.
Right. I wonder, I mean, I guess they were all just junkies that they all, shot up in the back of their neck.
Mhm.
Um,
So
it's
here
wild.
it is. So here's a picture so you guys can look. I mean, maybe there's a few people touching each other, but for the most part, these bodies look fairly neatly organized, almost like they were dragged and set there, and I don't see many bodies laying on top of other bodies. We could check out, I got another one here. Here's bodies again, fairly neatly organized. No bodies laying on top of other bodies. Here's another one, a more wide shot. Again, this is a very wide shot, but you don't see many bodies laying on top of other bodies. You see people clumped together, but and certainly there aren't enough bodies hidden under there to where the CIA or the whoever was counting them would have missed 500 of them. And there were also declassified documents from the FBI that came out recently that showed the FBI dragging these people when they were counting them. So like I said, they had to poke holes in each one of them. They had to interact with everybody. The idea that they counted 400 and missed 500 of the people who were laying there is just really, really, really hard to believe. And that is the official story of the CIA and the U.S. government, that there were too many bodies on top of other bodies, so they miscounted. There were, and I mean, John Judge calls this morbid arithmetic. That would have to mean that 408 bodies were covering up 505 bodies. And I mean, come on. Does that sound real?
You sound like a conspiracy theorist, Eddie. Have you ever considered that?
I haven't. I forgot to consider that. I will next time.
Yeah, Alex Jones.
So, anyways, suspiciously, the British Black Watch, which is British Special Forces, and U.S. Green Berets were doing training exercises in Guyana that day. Also, 100 Guyanese troops had been deployed into the jungle to find the 700 people who reportedly fled, but later all turned up dead. Most of... sorry, yeah.
Coincidence. That's
What?
just a coincidence, Eddie.
So John Judge says that the bodies looked like they were dragged. They looked like they had been dragged, which is why he suggests that maybe these people were killed by the Green Beret or killed by the British Black Watch and then dragged back to Jonestown. And there's an article critiquing John Judge. It's a horrible article. We'll talk about it later. There's an article critiquing his analysis here. And he says in that critique that there's no evidence that these bodies were dragged. Right, that's one of his critiques of John Judge. But since this article was written in 1985, FBI photos have been declassified showing them dragging the bodies. Right, so we know for sure now that these bodies were dragged and placed there. We don't know for sure that these people were killed in the jungle and then dragged and organized, but we know for sure that they were dragged.
Well, I just want to add, because what we're talking about is British Special Forces, American Special Forces, and then local Guyanese military, I assume. But what's the official name of Guyana? British Guyana, right? So people like sort of, because they're in the global South, assume that they're not affiliated with the U.S. and the West in some way, but they very much were. I just want to make like this was all under the jurisdiction of the our oligarchy. So yeah, I just needed to make that clear. That's all.
I believe the Guyanese leader at the time was put there literally in a CIA coup.
Mm-hmm.
And right, Guyana's always been basically a neo-colony. Now, there was more criticism from Guyanese doctors, Guyanese coroners, and the Guyanese press, right? They were like, this is a conspiracy. We don't believe what's going on. We don't believe our government officials who are corrupt by the U.S. We think they're lying to us. But those the top Guyanese officials basically just went along with the U.S. narrative and coincidentally received big grants from the United States around the same time that they did that. So yes, basically a neo-colony. So it's not hard to believe that a small number of Guyanese troops would have gone along with the CIA's plan. So speaking of which, Dr. Mutu was a Guyanese pathologist who was the first person on the scene, or one of the first people on the scene after the White Night. He was there for within hours. Dr. Mutu found no evidence of cyanide poisoning, which was what was supposedly in the Kool-Aid. Now, when somebody dies of cyanide poisoning, they get what's called cyanide rictus. It's an extremely painful death that basically messes up the signals to your brain. So you don't know how to breathe or pump blood through your body. So there's this shortness of breath and gasping. And people who die of cyanide usually end up in this contorted position, like they were suffering. None of the people had cyanide rictus. So Dr. Mutu immediately dismissed that cyanide poisoning could have been the reason for death. Cyanide poisoning is still the official reason for death given by the United States. They say that they drank cyanide Kool-Aid. He also found needle marks in the left shoulder blades of 80 to 90% of the victims, and the ones who didn't have needle marks had been shot or strangled to death. A little bit suspicious. A Guyanese grand jury took Mutu's testimony and ruled that the people were murdered. They ruled that maybe 2 or 3 of them committed suicide, but said that the rest had to be murdered. The grand jury, Dr. Mutu, all of this evidence coming out of Guyana saying that something weird is going on here was completely ignored in the U.S. We didn't even hear about this in the U.S. John Judge, in order to talk about this, had to dig through Guyanese press releases and Guyanese government documents, because if the U.S. press doesn't talk about it, how are we going to hear it? How are we going to get this information from Dr. Mutu out of Guyana? So high up Guyanese officials announced that originally announced the change in body count from 400 to 900, and the Guyanese public was shocked. They were like, "What do you mean there were 400 people dead and now there's 900?" And the press, the Guyanese press at the time, pointed out that there were large sums of money given to these Guyanese officials by the U.S. or just taken directly from Jonestown, because Jim Jones became a multi-billionaire and there was all this wealth in Jonestown that we were talking about before. And the Guyanese press made such a big deal about this, it became Templegate. They called it Templegate. Basically, that was the press's way of saying this is a conspiracy. Something's going on here. The body count greatly increased. And when our officials announced that and said nothing to see here, they were also getting money funneled to them from the United States.
It's wild to me. These things keep happening, right? These giant things like Jonestown, like we were talking about 9/11, like they happen over and over and over again. And the things just don't add up to anyone who even gets curious and says, let's look into what happened, right? Anyone, just a cursory glance. But we are so well trained to dismiss anything outside of the official narrative as this conspiracy theory that people don't take it seriously. And so I've seen people who have actually been curious about 9/11, for instance, and look into it and go, yeah, it doesn't add up, but I'm not some conspiracy theorist. Everything was on the level, but I'm like, wait a minute, you just said it doesn't add up. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, I'm sure it's fine. But there's some disconnect, and our ruling class plays on that and knows that it works like that. We can't, I said this earlier, letting them tell you to shut your brain off is the worst thing you could ever do.
Right. You should question everything. Why wouldn't you, based on what we know at this point? I mean, what was Operation Northwoods? They were literally going to shoot down a jet and blame it on the Cubans. You should question everything. And that's not to say that everything I'm telling you about Jonestown is 100% true, or 9/11 was 100% an inside job, but it's always good to be critical and look into these things. At the very least, in the case of 9/11, the people who did the hijacking were funded and armed by the U.S. in Afghanistan when they were anti-communists. And then the CIA and FBI were tracking them for years and didn't do anything, even though they knew they were plotting a terrorist attack. So question everything at the very least. But are you finding John Judge's argument to be fairly convincing so far, Noah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm kind of excited. I'm learning the paper through this medium, right? And getting sort of, since you've read it a few times, your more in-depth analysis of it as we go. I think I mean, there's a way that we can operate when researching events like this. And I think he's doing it really well. And as I was like pulling it up myself, even the way he puts the information together seems to me like the way that you would be asking questions as you're looking into the facts yourself. And so it's cool to sort of a question comes up as you're reading, and that question then gets answered directly after that, you know?
Absolutely. So to continue with the evidence, to take the bodies back to the United States after the White Night, the U.S. flew in 16 C-131 cargo planes, which look like, trying to bring up a picture, which look like this. They're freaking huge. They're thick planes. Yet despite this, it took the U.S. over a week to get all the bodies out of Guyana and back to the U.S. They were only transporting 30 bodies at a time, which, looking at the size of this plane, I think you could fit a lot more than 30 caskets in there. But they
Yeah.
transported 30 at a time, and by the time they got them back to the United States, the bodies had decomposed in the heat and they had rotted, which made an autopsy impossible. So they couldn't
Imagine
actually
that.
discover the cause of death. Would you imagine that? Later, the bodies were all cremated, with which enraged coroners, the press, and even family members at the time, because they were all denied access to the remains. So they took them back to, they let them decompose, then they took them back to the U.S., and then they burned them real quick before any coroners could even take a look at them. The president of the National Association of Medical Examiners at the time wrote an open letter to the U.S. military complaining about the lack of an autopsy and about the cremation of the body. So again, we have the pathologist in Guyana and this medical higher up in the United States saying you're not following procedure here. Something's going on here. And again, that not to say that proves the conspiracy, but it sure points to something going on. It sure points to the fact that what's going on is not what we're being told, and they're trying to cover something up. Yeah, Jones also had a privileged group of armed guards who were always at the People's Temple, and were always in Guyana. And any report you'll read about Jonestown will say this, that there were armed guards everywhere, not letting anybody leave. They were the ones who helped Larry Layton kill Leo Ryan. They killed the congressman when he showed up in Guyana to investigate. And the guards were mostly there to enforce discipline and
Real quick.
control labor, because once they got to Guyana, the temple basically became a big work camp. But we'll talk about that in a sec. Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, real quick. I wanted to go over, I forget the congressman's name. I think it's interesting what happens to him, because remember that people were going to this cult, right? And these people have families, they have friends, they have coworkers, they have neighbors, right? And so what happens is someone's family talks to their congressman. They're like, look, our family member, whoever it was, got taken in by this wild Jonestown thing, and they're off in Guyana now doing God knows what. Can you look into this for me? And this congressman, unlike anyone you could get nowadays, went to Guyana to investigate, because they began looking into it and shit wasn't adding up, right? Like, kind of gets him down this rabbit
we're gonna
hole.
get to that at some point.
Okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry then. Go ahead.
No, you're good. I just want to talk about Jones's CIA connections first. So his best friend was this guy named Dan Mitrione, who trained assassins and torturers in Latin America for U.S.-backed dictatorships. And he took Jim Jones to Brazil, where he would regularly, or where he lived for a while, and would regularly visit Belo Horizonte, which is the head of the CIA headquarters in Brazil. He told people in Brazil, Jim Jones did, that his stay there was funded by U.S. intelligence and the U.S. Navy. He was also best buds with Walter Heady once he went back to San Francisco, who was one of the heads of the John Birch Society, which is an ultra-right advocacy group. And many people, including the Layton family, were very wealthy and connected to U.S. intelligence agencies. So there were all these rich people who were either connected to U.S. intelligence or connected to groups that funded the rise of the Nazis in Germany, who were heavily funding the People's Temple, dumping money into it. And they helped Jim Jones exercise financial control over the temple members, basically by saying, like, there were like a bunch of temple members who were collecting Social Security, a bunch of them who were collecting disability checks, and Jim Jones would have them all sign that money over to him. So by the time he got caught, he was a multi-billionaire, and that's how they funded the rise.
Can I just say, like, real quick, because this was the People's Temple and nominally socialist, communisty, whatever, what better way for the ruling class to present the left and communist to the public, right? A wild cult that's taking advantage of everybody and all this other crazy stuff, stealing and all the rest. This is literally this is the first, or not the first, but an earlier version of Vosh.
Yes, this is what they want people to think socialism is. Vosh. So basically, once they got to Guyana, the place where Jonestown was located was on top of billions and billions of dollars in untapped mineral wealth. Now, these minerals and resources were deep in the jungles of Guyana, and there had been many efforts by multinational corporations to mine these areas and extract these resources before, but they had all been unsuccessful because it was deep into the jungle and it was hard to get workers there. That is exactly where the People's Temple set up once it went to Guyana, right on top of all these minerals, all right, on top of all these resources. And basically, once they got there, Jonestown became a work camp where the people were working 16 to 18 hours a day. And those armed guards that we were talking about were there to enforce discipline and enforce labor, and organize labor to make sure that resource extraction was continuing. At this point, one of Leo Ryan's constituents wrote to him complaining that his son had joined the Jonestown cult and was maybe trapped. And another one of his constituents wrote to him saying that their son had been killed after trying to leave Jonestown. So he got 2 letters from people, including one letter from his friend, asking him to go investigate Jonestown. So despite being warned by people around him not to go, he eventually agrees, and he takes a press team with him to investigate in Guyana. That's where he's killed and where the White Night happens, and when all these people commit suicide. So the thesis that John Judge is saying here is that Jonestown was basically an extension of the CIA's MK Ultra project. They brought in these disaffected people, these poor and downtrodden people, got them drugged up, brought them to Guyana basically by force, and then had them mine this incredibly mineral-rich area. But when Congressman Leo Ryan got letters from his constituents asking him to go check it out, the CIA had to cover their tracks. They had to cover up the work camp. So that's when they did the White Night and basically killed Leo Ryan and killed everybody there. Now, if you watch any mainstream documentaries about about Jonestown, almost all of what you're going to see is people working. You're going to see people in these work camps. And Jim Jones just talking about how great it is here. A lot of the pictures with Jim Jones, like this one, he's surrounded by heavy machinery, heavy earth-moving machinery, heavy extraction machinery, because that's what was going on at the People's Temple in Guyana. It was just a giant work camp. It was just a giant group of people who was there to extract these resources. So, that's the idea, that this was the CIA's MK Ultra project, brought these people, or tried to brainwash and manipulate these people and then bring them to Guyana and extract these resources. But once a congressman was about to figure out what was going on and expose it to the press, they had to cover their tracks. So they killed everybody and then said, oh, they all just drank Kool-Aid. They all just drank cyanide and died. That's the conspiracy.
They did all just drink cyanide and die, you conspiracy theorist.
I'm sorry.
You better be.
The idea
you
too,
tankies, I swear to God.
Because
you don't believe in the Uyghur genocide. You believe in all these crazy conspiracy theories. I mean, what was 9/11 disconnected from the Iraq War too? I mean, come on. You probably believe in Benghazi.
Part of the MK Ultra project was they wanted to brainwash people to the point where they could tell them to commit suicide, and the people would, because that would be, a nice trait for a spy to have. You tell them to off themselves and they do it. So the idea is that they actually tried to do the White Knight, right? Because they would do these suicide drills where they would practice the White Knight ceremony and try and get it in people's heads that we're going to do this mass suicide. The idea is that, maybe some people drank the Kool-Aid, but then a bunch of the other ones ran off into the jungle where they were rounded up by British Black Watch or U.S. Green Berets. And then the ones who weren't found, because there were about 100 people who weren't found, probably just died in the jungle. And again, the Guyanese government was heavily backed by the CIA at this point. And in Jonestown, it was well known that they were drugging people up, and anybody who tried to leave, they would inject them with a bunch of drugs, and even mainstream sources will say this. So very similar to MK Ultra, where they were drugging people up and trying to destroy their brains, trying to control them and use them for cheap labor. It's exactly what these people were being used for, is cheap labor, allegedly. There are also other examples of things like Jonestown. So you may never have heard of this, but there was basically a Jonestown under the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. This is called Colonia Dignidad. Colonia Dignidad was an isolated colony established in post-World War II Chile by immigrant Germans, former Nazis probably, similar to Jonestown, which became notorious for internment, torture, and the murder of dissidents during the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in the 70s. Also a dictatorship installed by the CIA. More CIA connections to cults with cheap labor, if you still think this is ridiculous. Under the leadership of German emigre preacher Paul Schaefer, who has been described, or it's been described as a state within a state. Schaefer and members of the colony were deeply religious and followed the teachings of William Branham. The main legal economic activity of the colony was agriculture at various periods. It was also home to a few things. Their longest continuous leader was this guy. He was a fugitive accused of molestation in Germany, where he went to Chile and basically ran this cult that served as a source of cheap resources for the Chilean fascist dictatorship. So it's a cult that they set up on top of a bunch of resources run by a bunch of former Nazis to get cheap labor. And this is real. This is something that we know exists. This is something that we know where they were doing mass torture and all these weird things, basically at Jonestown, except we know it. It's out in the open. There's no conspiracy. So and this was CIA supported as well. So the idea that the CIA wouldn't support something like this, of course they would.
In the first half of the 20th century, you have to remember the time period. The first half of the 20th century, one of the big scientific questions was, can a human mind be controlled like this? And all of the various world intelligence agencies were carrying out these sort of MK Ultra like experiments. They really experimented with hallucinogens and the suggestibility of people on hallucinogens. This was one of the big parts of MK Ultra. There was a documentary that one of the scientists attached to an early MK Ultra experiment wasn't aware that they were also experimenting on these scientists, right? And so he writes a book or something, and they made a documentary out of it, and he ended up killing himself. And I forget the guy's name. I wish I could remember it. But the documentary was brilliant and really well done. I have a terrible memory, so I apologize. But it's sort of when it gets big in the U.S. with the CIA, comes directly on the heels of Nazi scientists being recuperated into our establishment. And I think that's important to remember that a lot of this comes from the Nazis.
Right. MK Ultra did, and probably Jonestown. Like I said, there were these people who were connected to U.S. intelligence and connected to the Nazis in Nazi Germany. those are the kind of people who would be interested in something like MK Ultra, and especially interested in actually carrying out, you know, what they learned from MK Ultra, actually using the lessons of MK Ultra to create a cheap labor camp in Guyana. That's exactly the kind of thing that the Nazis would have been working on. So it made sense that these Nazis who were rehabilitated and brought into the American establishment and U.S. intelligence agencies would be working on something like this.
Mm.
So that, and the CIA has a long history of using cults. I mean, there's the Unification Church, which was backed
Yep.
by Korean intelligence and the CIA. There's the World Anti-Communist League, WACL. There's the Moonies, and those are just the ones mentioned by John Judge in this article. But we all know about the Falun Gong, right? That is like the CIA's number one way of pushing anti-China propaganda. The Falun Gong has millions of dollars somehow. And they're this psychotic anti-China cult that at one point believed Trump was sent by God to destroy China, right? That's the CIA's main way of destabilizing China and pushing anti-China propaganda is this cult. So you think it's above the CIA to work with a cult? Definitely not.
And it's also not above creating newspapers and journals and multimedia apparatuses. The Falun Gong has a newspaper they target at conservative Americans called the Epoch Times, right? Literally trying to sway them into the Falun Gong way of thinking. Someone in the chat said they think I was talking about Wormwood. I know what you're talking about. That's like a dramatization of something else. But no, that's it. When I remember the guy's name, I'll let you know.
Boris says Guyana has more cults, not only Jonestown. Yeah, there's basically another cult in Guyana that's just like Colonia Dignidad and just like Jonestown. It's right on top of this super mineral rich area, and it's basically like a Zionist thing. They believe they're like the true inheritors of Israel, and it's some sort of Jewish cult, but like you said, it's all about psychological manipulation. Exactly.
Yep.
Additionally, Leo Ryan's friend, Joe Holzinger, Leo Ryan, the congressman who was killed, studied the Jonestown for 2 years after his friend was killed and came to the conclusion that it was a murder, not a suicide, and that the intelligence agencies were involved with some kind of mind control project. So someone who studied the event because his friend was involved in it came to the same conclusions. But of course, you never hear that on the news, and that just gets dropped down what Orwell called the memory hole.
You know, I don't get me wrong. I hate Slavoj Žižek as much as the next guy. One of the reasons is his CIA connections, right? And him being an anti-communist, where he's actually from, and working with the CIA to bring socialism down. But because of those connections, he said some interesting things. And he was talking about his friends in military research, right? And this question of mind control. And he said something that stuck with me since then. The really terrifying thing about what they're learning is that people always think mind control is, you know, some force from outside your body is forcing you to do something or say something, right? But that's not how it works, according to the people that Zizek was talking about. He says that what it feels like is more like the thought they want you to have, the thing they want you to do, feels organic to you because your brain is actually doing that thing, right? Like it's not your idea to lift your right arm, right? That's implanted in you, but you feel like it is. It's very bizarre the way he explained it. If I could find a link, I'd post it, but I'm sure you can find it if you Google search it or YouTube search it.
For sure. Yeah, so that's all I've got on Jonestown. I felt that I would be remiss. There's an article criticizing John Judge's article called Escaping the Event Horizon, a rebuttal to John Judge's The Black Hole of Guyana. And I read this because I had to do my due diligence to you guys, and this is not a good read. I'm sorry. Like, read it if you want, right? Read the John Judge essay and then read this essay and tell me who you think is right. But this whole article comes off like a liberal telling you, do you really think the CIA would do that? Do you really think the American government would do that? No, you idiot. Facepalm. facepalm conspiracy moment. It is an insufferable article. The guy talks about himself so much. He's just not a good writer. Versus John Judge, his article gets right into the substance, right? Here's my thesis. Here's my argument. Here's the evidence. Believe it or don't believe it. This guy's got just pages and pages of rambling rather than substance. And it comes off as the most, and he also uses snarkiness in place of good arguments, which is, it's all the liberal tactics. But at one point he says that John Judge tries to tie Jonestown to groups he doesn't like when he's talking about the connections to the CIA, and he mocks him. You're just trying to tie them together with groups that you don't like. No, it's not that he just doesn't like the CIA. It's that the CIA is notorious for doing stuff like this. It's that the CIA had a brainwashing project that's now common knowledge called MK Ultra, where they were trying to do the kind of stuff that was actually going on at Jonestown. Right? There are real connections here, and the CIA is a real armed body of the state that serves to prop up the capitalist class and help further their super exploitation of the working class. It's not that John Judge just doesn't like the CIA. He also shows, this guy shows one picture of a body on top of another body and says that this discredits John Judge's argument that there couldn't have been 400 bodies covering up 500 bodies. So John Judge says there's no way 400 bodies were covering up 500 bodies like the U.S. government says. And this guy responds, no, look at this picture. Look, see? There's one kid who's kind of laying under his parents. Therefore, we can totally accept the fact that the U.S. government miscounted by about 500. So horrible counter argument there. I won't even talk. He also argues that the UK special forces couldn't have been involved because why would the US outsource something like this to a foreign nation? That's a bad idea. As if the UK empire hasn't always been working together with the US empire. Like, bro, just Google the 1953 coup of Mohammad Mossadegh. Who did that? It was the British MI6 and the US CIA. Do you think that the British are so upstanding and moral people that they would turn in the CIA for doing something like this? No. Since the end of World War II, they've been working together with the CIA to do shit like this. The CIA and the MI6, everybody knows they work together. Everybody knows that the British Empire is just a subservient little outpost of the U.S. empire at this point. Just look at how they followed along with all the U.S.'s Ukraine policy. So, yeah, I won't spend too much more time on this guy, but he also said that his stupidest critique of John Judge's article is that there's no evidence that any of the bodies were being dragged, right? He says John Judge claims these bodies were being dragged, but there's no evidence for that. But FBI photos have been declassified since both articles were written, literally showing people dragging the bodies. So when that guy actually does bring up a point of substance in his article, I found it to be something ridiculous like this, where he's saying the bodies weren't dragged. Clearly, John Judge's essay is all wrong. There's nothing going on here except the establishment narrative, with a whole bunch of snark. But read that article if you want. It's not worth it. You're going to end up screaming at your iPad like I was. But yeah, thanks for going on that journey with